Hello again. So now we've talked about the mechanics driving your game, the theme binding it together, and the gameplay principles of player agency, randomness, and stakes that all have their part in informing the gameplay.
Definitely a solid start, Stephen. What's the next step?
In our game design process slide, we can see that we've made it to the second box on the right. This involves prototyping, playtesting, and, as throughout the entire process, iteration. We're now on the third stage of game design, prototyping.
Now that you have an idea of how your game should play, you're going to want it to be playable by others. In this chapter, we're talking about communicating what you've come up with to the players of your game.
That brings us to the primary communication tools of board games, the physical components and the instructions. The early design of these elements is called prototyping. Many times, the prototyping process will lead to changes to your components and rules at the same time, as you come to realize things that need to be changed in order to support your other ideas. So let's get started. At its core, prototyping is the creation of a physical representation of your game concepts, not the creation of the game. This means that while you want to have a stand-in for each component and function of the game, you aren't trying to finalize these designs at this stage. Before prototyping, you have probably already conceptualized how the game will work. The creation of a prototype allows you to test your game systems in a real sense. The first prototype is intended to be a platform to test the game systems and core gameplay. At this point, you're working to create an understandable model of your game to be used by your playtesters. You want any components you're using to be easily replaceable. You'll be iterating on this design constantly, so you don't want to invest too heavily into this stage of the prototype.
Depending on what mechanics you have in place and how your game will shape up, the methods and components required to prototype your game will vary. For many games, their prototypes can simply be created with pencil and paper, perhaps on graph paper. Other games may have slightly more involved steps. The key is to keep your prototype stages as simple and abstract as possible until you've further refined your game. Your prototype should progress as your game is tested and is further developed. All games, however, will need a way to get across the rules to the players, usually in the form of a rulebook.
Some additional considerations are player count, which is how many players you want to be able to play the game at one time. Also consider how many should play the game. What's the target number? Which brings us to scalability. This is the ability of a game to adjust itself to a varying number of players. Things to consider for this are teams, even or odd number imbalance, component limitations, and action delay. More players will mean more components you need stand-ins for and more costs down the line.
So you remember Battleship? Battleship's design as a laptop/radar screen is very interesting and striking. It is also a precisely manufactured product. You may want to have an intricate design later on, but for right now, stick to something you can rework quickly. You can play Battleship on some graph paper when testing the core game. The physical components of a game can be a large draw or a large deterrent to a game. A game with brightly colored pieces may be perceived as less serious, while one with wooden or metal pieces may be seen as more serious. Games with a lot of pieces, or those with elaborate figures, are generally viewed as more complex. These perceptions may or may not be correct, but they do often form the basis of potential players' first opinion of a game. The purpose of adding physical pieces should always be to improve the player's ability to perceive the game's information. Components are simply communication tools. More components to a game also tends to create longer setup and cleanup times, which can also be a downside to the game's appeal. Strive to have only as few components as are needed for your game.
Chess is more complex than checkers, which is reflected in the varied pieces involved. The important thing is that the pieces support the rules, not the other way around. It would be difficult to keep up with which was a pawn and which was a rook were it not for the varied designs. For that matter, imagine trying to keep up with the rules for the pieces if they didn't have the names. Physical components give a tangible representation of game concepts and allow the players to more easily track information of the game's events. Consider that some experienced players of chess can play an entire game blindfolded, or even entirely without the board and pieces by simply declaring which piece will move to which grid space. However, that requires a great deal of memory and mastery. The game pieces moving across the physical space of the board makes tracking those positions on the grid much easier. In prototyping, you'll mostly use placeholder items, but as you start thinking about the finished game, you may want to look into items with clear communication.
Making your rulebook. Rules are the method by which you, the designer, establish the player's interactions with your mechanics. Developing property to extract higher rent is a mechanic in Monopoly. Having to develop every property in the set equally is a rule. Instructions should be clear and concise. Ideally, a rule provides the framework for the game without room for interpretation. If you have to clarify a rule, take a look at what's causing the confusion or conflict. Can the rule be written better? Can the components provide better communication? What mechanical goal of the game does it serve? If the rule is causing confusion, it is worth considering what value the rule adds to begin with.
Complexity is a bit tricky to really define, but think of it as the number of moving parts your game has. You can also think of it as the overall amount of knowledge the game requires, or how long it will take players to learn the core mechanics. Complexity is separate from depth and weight. A game can be very deep without having a great deal of complexity. Go is an example of this, with very simple rules but a great deal of depth. Also of note is that complexity is referring to the complexity of the rules, not complexity of the game itself. Go has an almost unfathomable amount of possible moves, but very few rules.
Both the number of rules and the number of rule interactions will determine your game's overall complexity. For example, the property development progression chain, which is 4 houses to a hotel, and the rule of equal property development in Monopoly create a rule interaction of additional complexity and scarcity to the game economy. A player choosing not to progress beyond 4 houses can rapidly deplete the 32 houses, 8 properties worth, included in the box, thus depriving other players the chance to develop at all. Individually, the rules of property development appear meant to spread out development funds and increase the leading player's overall expenditure. However, taken together, they create a chance to cut other players out of the game. This is an example of rule interaction creating complexity. Did you get a little lost in that example? That's essentially complexity at work. The more systems you have interacting together, the more complex the game is, and the more effort players have to spend in order to learn and understand the game.
So complexity isn't inherently good or bad, but the complexity of a game system should always be justified by the relative value it brings to the game. Complexity can help provide depth, but it can also make the game less approachable or enjoyable for players. Complexity can be managed through the use of keywords, icons, or symbols to link game concepts.
Competitive games have to consider balance more than any other area. Also, if direct competition will occur in a game, clarify who wins ties, both in action phases and at the end of the game. Be specific and clear. Consider adding additional layers to the tiebreaker if possible. For instance, in Dominion, you win with victory point, with ties decided in favor of the player with the fewest turns. This actually leads to a lot of ties, which some players find frustrating. House rules have sprung up to add additional tiebreakers, like most treasure or fewest cards.
For player elimination, consider if your game is going to allow it. If it does allow player elimination, does it encourage it? Because if player elimination is part of the game, make sure you have rules to make it apparent how that event is handled. If it's encouraged or a viable strategy, make sure it will further the enjoyment of the game. Player elimination is necessary for some game concepts to work, but don't implement it lightly. An eliminated player can be very frustrated, particularly if the game continues to go on for a long while after. In general, elimination is best in short games or as an ending condition for long games. In short, party-style games, it's easier to laugh off the loss and jump back in on the next hand. In longer games, players feel more invested in their strategy and may not take the losses easily.
An instance where a rare interaction of rules and or components creates an event outside the intended flow of play, which is not addressed by the game's core rules, is an edge case. The common Band-Aid solution is to provide clarification for the rule interaction. The better solution is to try to go back and correct the rules to avoid edge case occurrences altogether. Remember, even if it is a 1 in a million chance of occurring, that may be a person's first time trying the game, which might ruin their experience.
When writing rules, it's critical to be totally mindful of the chosen words. Rules must be clear, which means stating exactly what should occur for the players in that step of the game.
Remember that using words like may or can will dramatically change the function of a rule by giving players agency over whether they take the action or not. This can be good or bad, depending on your game. Always consider if the rule or action must be followed for the game to function. If so, use imperative wording like must or will, or state the rule plainly. Example, a player may move up to 3 spaces on his or her turn. In stating up to, this rule allows a player to choose how far they move. This wording also allows the player to not move at all if they'd like, as it has may come before the movement. If it is critical that a move be made, a better wording would be, on their turn, a player moves between 1 and 3 spaces. Or a player must move on their turn, moving their piece 1, 2, or 3 spaces.
Being inclusive is a good idea too. Using he or she, forms of they, or neutral player language is a good approach. Some rules also alternate between the he and she on different rules, but I personally recommend using player-centric language and using they as the pronoun.
In the exercise for this chapter, you'll be creating the rulebook for your game using the following steps. First, analyze your current game design concept and then test it out. Do the systems work? Do they need more components or maybe fewer? Make corrections to trouble spots and then test again. Is there another way the rules could work? Seeing the functions of your game laid out may inspire you to make some changes, and that's a good thing. Test out any rule changes you think up. Adjust things as you see fit, but most areas of balance will probably need outsider playtesting. And if you find areas that you feel may be problematic, but you aren't quite certain, make a note of it as something to watch during playtesting. Feel free to experiment during this stage. Go through a typical round of play and write down each step you have to take. You'll use this to create a working set of rules for playtesting. Once you have some rules, go through the round again, following the rules you've written. Do they appear to cover the flow of gameplay? Make sure you follow the rules exactly as you do this. Remember, players won't have you there to explain the rules to them. The rules must stand out on their own.
So, as an update on Galactic Auctioneer, which is our new name for our card game that we're working on, we've gotten a basic prototype set up using ordinary playing cards. I've sharpied onto some of the face cards in order to make action cards, and I'm using the jokers as wilds. This let me get a workable prototype without a great deal of extra effort. I'm not entirely happy with it, as the action cards can be hard to read, but overall it was a quick build I can iterate on, and that's really the goal. Playing card sets are only about $1 a piece, so it's inexpensive as well. This will let me play the game myself or with Patrick to accomplish the first set of playtests. Once we're happy with the results, we'll make a prototype that's a little more unique. Eventually, I sort of want to make the theme aliens selling human relics, where each suit is a common type of human item, and the pieces all look slightly more worn down as they go up in number, supporting the mechanic of ones beating tens. In this example, a pristine spork might get traded for a pair of like new utensils, but it would be more valuable than 10 bent forks or what have you. We aren't worried about art just yet, though. We've got the first draft of rules finished and are now building out full instructions for the game.
So now that you've learned about how to make the rules for your game, go and experiment and have fun, and we'll see you next week.